Hi, this is Adina here with today's episode of Courage to be Curious with Adina Tovell, and today, of course, with Amy Steindler as well. So Courage to be Curious with Adina and Amy. Hey, Amy.
Hi there. Good to see you.
And we are so excited because the month of September is going to be about the power of questions. Amy and I ask questions for a living. We ask questions of ourselves all of the time. We read about questions, we write about questions, we think about questions, and we want you to as well. So we are dedicating an entire month to thinking about the power of questions. And since this is the first episode in the month, we also want to preview what is coming. Now, I have mentioned this on a previous podcast, this book, Ask Powerful Questions, Create Conversations That Matter. Two authors, Will Wise and Chad Littlefield. And we are so fortunate because they are bringing their incredible wisdom, sense of humor, and fantastic energy to the podcast. So the lead episode, we will be talking with Will, and in our grand finale episode, we'll be talking with Chad. And we are just going to have a tremendous amount of fun, I think, Amy, this month talking about questions. So Amy, let's start off. And I think it's good for us to just think about why questions, like why do we find questions so powerful that you and I basically run businesses off of asking questions? So, let's just jam on this for a little bit. For you, when you think about questions and the use of questions in your life and in your work, what comes to mind for you?
There's something so compelling about a well-asked question, and just and I don't want to use the word right, but I'm going to use it anyway, the right question at the right time. Like just finding that question that resonates. Let's call it the resonant question, right?
Love that.
So, and for me and for my clients, and I wonder, I imagine it's true for you too, it's about connection. That's a moment of like true connection. Like someone is stopped in their tracks by the question, and it's like, wow, that is the question I need to answer for myself right now. So I think there's just something so compelling about being able to connect with someone on a level that just stops them in their tracks.
And I like that word. I've got to start taking that on, the resonant question. Because what that word really means, like when something resonates, we actually can feel it, right? We can feel something happening inside when it resonates. Sometimes we hear somebody talk about something and say, wow, that really resonates, which actually means that we've started to have some kind of response inside that's moving and shifting us. And as you talked about asking the resonant question, the right one in the right moment, and what that can do to bring connection, to stimulate discernment, I also really like to talk about that the same happens inside myself, right? When I go to ask myself a question, and I talk about the fact that I often journal, my journal entries often begin with a question, not surprising, right? But my journal entries often begin with a question. And then I'll see where it takes me. And then suddenly more questions will arise. And they almost become like the current that is pulling me along to discover and reveal something that needs to come to the surface.
I love that metaphor. Current, surface, water, right? The idea that this is part of your flow. It's part of your process. It's part of the flow of your life. I love that.
And I have found that, and this, like in my life right now, this is one of the periods where there's a lot of things kind of popping up in my life, right? The unexpected things that arise in our life often give us create the most amount of discomfort, or, we kind of get a little jittery and nervous or uncomfortable with the uncertainty or the transitions. And I always find that that's a particularly poignant time to start asking questions, because my alternative is getting engulfed by the anxiety or the stress, right? I have two options. And, for a long time, I remember just getting kind of consumed and swallowed into, the swirling siphon of just anxiety while something was going on that I didn't have control over. And what I found recently is that, as you said, the question stops you in your tracks. Well, if I want to stop the swirling, asking a question about where I am, what possible responses I can have, what other ways I can see it, really helps to just stop all of that swirling and bring me to a new place.
So let's add to the connection piece that a resonant question also pulls us into the present moment. And it gives us that meta awareness and takes us out, as you said, out of the swirl, and gives us a perspective on it, right? An observer perspective. So I want to add mindfulness and present moment awareness to that list.
Which is beautiful because we just finished a whole month of talking about perspective. And so questions as having this incredible power of bringing us or positioning us to have a new perspective on something.
Absolutely. And I think, at some point we need to address the non-resonant questions and where they come from and what happens when someone puts one of those out there. And as a coach, that happens to me sometimes. I'll ask a question that just doesn't resonate. And, what do you do with that?
Which I love, right? Because even as a coach, it's not like we've got the secret Bible of questions and like, oh, here's the one for this moment. And you pull that out and you're going to hit the bullseye every time. Because some questions, and what I love about it is that if I throw out a bunch of questions, especially with someone else, that aren't very resonant, where I don't see that kind of shift or curiosity start to happen, I know that good, that's information. It's not that. Like, this isn't the right path. This isn't the right path. I get to start to eliminate paths or ways of thinking that are not the resonant one, which is as useful as, the other one, because it's getting us closer to finding it. And it's not about this. I never feel badly. Like if I, pitch one over the net and nothing happens, I'm like, oh, okay, great. Let me pitch another one and see what happens. So there's this piece of like, and then it when you hit the right one, when you find that resonant one, because there's an entire like shift, right? And in body and energy and facial expression.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think for me, when it, it's almost like you're listening to this beautiful symphony and all of a sudden, somebody hits the wrong key, and it just sticks out and it just doesn't work. And, it's okay. And it's okay to have a sense of humor about it. And so I think, for our listeners, if you're thinking about, how do I become better at asking questions, at being curious, at developing my curiosity. And, for those who maybe haven't heard, some of the previous podcasts, I talk about how I was not delivered into this world with a wellspring of curiosity. I mean, I was, as a tiny person, we all are. At some point, I lost all of that. And so I'm still developing that skill of staying with the curiosity. So, we don't want to let those moments discourage us from continuing to find other questions. So I just want to throw that out there for anyone who's listening that's maybe a little bit gun shy around, is it okay for me to ask deep questions?
Two things that what you were just talking about made me think of is one is a resource question, right? So this book on Ask Powerful Questions that we're going to be hearing more about this month definitely talks about how to construct and put together powerful questions. So I love that. I also really love Warren Berger's work. He wrote a book called A More Beautiful Question, which I love. And Amy, it looks like it's pulling it off her shelf. So there you go. If you're watching the video, she's got it right there. If I were in my office, I'd be pulling down my copy too. And then he also has a second follow-up book that is called A Book of More Beautiful Questions, where he has an entire book. And then, Amy, there's this resource that we're going to get into in a moment, which is from Courage to Be Curious here, and our own set of questions as well, because we've got 3 decks of 52 questions each, which makes like 156 questions that are all really powerful questions to ask. And so we're going to get in a little bit to working with that. The other thing that you said that I just want to make note of before we do that, because we're going to have some fun, is how do you know if it's okay to ask the question? right? And that to me is like the title of this, Courage to be Curious, right? The curiosity part, but there is some courage in it because we recognize that asking a resonant question, like it feels almost intimate, right? You know, and
Absolutely. Absolutely.
and there's this sense of, do we have permission to enter an intimate space with someone? And here's, I think, and Amy, I would love to hear your response to it too, but here's my response to it is, I think one of our deepest desires as humans is to be seen and to be known, right? Like we want to be understood. I don't know that I've ever met somebody who says, "Oh, I love going to parties and having all that surface level conversation," right? Like who loves that? I mean, some people are better at it than others, but who actually loves that? Most often I hear people say, I went, I had fun, but I don't know, like, how do you really have conversations? Or they don't like going to parties because they feel like there isn't anything meaningful happening, or they're sitting at home with their family feeling like we're just going through the motions and watching TV and eating dinner, but I don't feel like we're really connecting. And I would want to say, what if we trusted that most people would like to be seen and known and heard and understood rather than assuming that they didn't?
I love that. I love that assumption of sort of positive intent, which I'm sure we'll talk about again. And there's an element of trust here that has to be established, right? I think you touched on it a moment ago. It's okay to ask permission. Can I ask you something that I've been curious about for a while? And it's not a kind of a surfacey question. So asking permission is perfectly okay. And I think the trust piece comes from intention. And, I've been reading, and maybe it was an Ask Powerful Questions. I can't remember. I'm reading like 4 books, so I can't remember which one it was. But the idea of stating your intention first to give context, to let people know, hey, I've been thinking about you and about our relationship. And, I really want to deepen that. It's important to me, our friendship. Could I ask you a question about that?
It's interesting that you said that. So I was recently talking with somebody who is starting to date and, wanting to have first date and talking about how very often first dates are so surface level, right? We ask about this and what do you do for work? And, where do you and we ask these things, but then at the end, don't necessarily know at the end whether or not you really like the person or you don't like the person. Like you don't really have a sense of anything except whether and then if there's pauses in the conversation, it feels awkward because it's like, okay, someone's got to shoot another question out there just to kind of keep things rolling. But there isn't a knowing that can happen. There isn't like a connection that feels genuine happening. And so we were talking about these different levels. Like you can have the very surface level question, and then you have the very deep level question. And it didn't feel necessarily right to ask really, really deep question, like super deep on the first date either necessarily, because, well, maybe second or third, but not a first date. So what's between the surface and what's between and the bottom of the sea here? Like we're really going super deep. And we took topics and said, what's that middle level question that does help the person reveal something about themselves, but doesn't force them to be so vulnerable and where they can have some fun with it. And, so we actually practiced and played with constructing questions that would fall between those two that would be totally appropriate on a first date, but not feel like and would bring forth meaningful connection and insight on the person without feeling like, oh my God, they're so deep that you could turn somebody off in the first second.
Oh, I want to see that list.
Maybe we'll have to post that list.
I think we need that list. It's somewhere between where'd you go to school and, your most embarrassing moment. I don't know, maybe most embarrassing moment is okay for a first date. But yeah, I want to know what's in there,
Well, I think even just to kind of give a glimpse, like when you said, where did you go to school or something like that? Okay, we talked about staying away from questions where there might be a one-word answer. Oh, here's the name of the university, which doesn't really give you anything about the person, but asking about, what's the most, interesting professor you've encountered in school so far, right? is going to, it's not a one word answer. It's something that's going to reveal, like, does this person have a sense of humor? How serious are they about their schoolwork? What topics are they finding interesting? Like, something is going to come out of that. Other than just asking, like, where do you go to school? But, who's the most interesting professor you had so far? And, what's something that they've done that really struck you? Like, okay, that's a reasonable question, I think.
And I love that you're talking about what interests them, right? So you can ask that question in so many different contexts. What's the most interesting thing you're working on? What's the most interesting thing you've seen on the news lately? Just what are you interested in? Because that's what we want to talk about, right? We want to talk about what we're interested in, not what we don't care about. So I love that sort of line that you're going down there, Dina, of what's most interesting about that.
So, and that's a little bit of a preview, because when we do have Will Wise on the podcast in the third week in September, actually, we're going to play some games with questions, like challenge each other to come up with questions, like on the fly, on the spot. We're going to have a little bit of fun. So you want to come back for that one, because we're going to have a good time. But today, Amy, I thought we would take the Live deck of the Live with the Courage to be Curious. I've been talking about these card decks for a long time. I've been writing about them, and I've never done this before on the podcast, where we just pull cards and say, what does it sound like to respond to one of these questions? What does it sound like to encounter them? And my hope was, in creating them, is that, one, it would provide people with examples of some questions. Some people have told me that they place them on the table at dinner, and suddenly they're teenagers and young adult children who would never, ever, ever share and be as revealing, like if their parent asked them a question, suddenly will in response to a card, because there's no presumption of judgment or expectation when the card asks the question, as opposed to the parents, right? So people who've done that, put them out on a coffee table or a dinner table. And then, other times where people have used them for journal writing. But what can you actually do with them? And how can you use them to just kind of reveal what's going on inside and get more connected to yourself? So that's what we're going to do today, Amy.
I love that. And I just want to highlight what you said. It's so interesting to me. And I wonder if you have more to say about it. The idea that it's the card asking the question, not the other person. Why is that so compelling?
I think when we're in relationship with people, there's so much history and background that when somebody asks a question, our mind goes to well, why are they asking that? Do they think something about that? They try to figure out what the angle is. And so they don't, I think, feel as free. I mean, I know that, if somebody asks me a question, my first thought might be okay, what's the reason they're asking me that? Either are they asking, and I want to know so I can give them an answer that really answers what they want to know, or is there some backstory here that I might think is at play here, and this is some kind of insidious thing going on? And I think we do that when a person, because we have a whole backstory of a relationship that comes into play when the question gets asked.
I think that's true. And I'm wondering, how do we, since we're up in our heads, thinking about what the other person's motivation might be, what is the best way to kind of get past that or get through that? Is it a question back saying, oh, interesting question, what made you ask that one? And sometimes I'll answer the question and then ask, that was an interesting question, what made you ask that one? Just to satisfy my own either curiosity or calm my neurosis about what I think they might be after. But I'm curious, I mean, how do you process that for yourself? How do you get past that moment?
Well, sometimes I do. If I think that they're asking a question and they could mean multiple things by it, then I will say, tell me, why you're asking that question, mostly because I want to, know that I'm answering in the right direction, because I am always blown away and fascinated that when I ask a question like that, how many different responses I could get. What's in my head is definitely not what's in the other person's head. And I'm always sort of blown away, oh, that makes sense. That wasn't what I was thinking, but awesome. Let me answer that question then, right? And so sometimes I ask it so that I know that I'm kind of answering the question that they actually intended to ask, because words can mean so many different things. And then sometimes if I'm maybe nervous or a little on edge that there's some sort of motive there, then I feel like it's better to have the motive out on the table other than otherwise I feel like I'm sort of walking into a trap or wondering if I'm walking into a trap, which might make me more guarded in how I answer. And that way that would interfere with the connection.
Yeah, that's so interesting that, and I want to keep this on the table too, this idea of assuming positive intent and how when we're in relationships, and we'll talk about this more in the love section, I think, how we're in relationships with people that we know care about us, and yet we still don't assume positive intent. We still wonder, is this a trap? Is there something going to happen to me here? So just want to flag that for everybody.
Yes, well, we're definitely going to get more deeply into that in the love episode here. So, but what I wanted to do, Amy, as I said, is that we'll pick cards. We're going to pick cards for each other. And I wanted to give people the opportunity to witness, right? Whether auditorily, because you're on podcast, or visually and auditorily, if you're watching this on YouTube here, what our experiences are. And they're not right or wrong, but they're just another, I always think of that like Wizard of Oz thing, like when you get to pull back the curtain and, Nina talks about question all the time. Well, like, what does that mean to her? Like, how does she actually do it? Or how does Amy do it? So I love this idea that we're going to like pull back the curtain and actually share that.
All right. Roll it.
All right. Well, I'm going to let you pick one first. I will take the vulnerable seat first. You get to pick a question out of the live deck and tell us what it is.
All right. I have my live deck in front of me, and I am just going to take the one that's on top, which says, you're going to hate me. What keeps appearing right in front of me that I refuse to see? Let's just start with the easy one.
So what keeps appearing right in front of me that I refuse to see? It is really amazing. I have been looking at this one thing like probably for a good 10 to 12 years. And it's like right there. And I do even look at it, but I just somehow or another don't seem to fully connect with it. Like I'm just starting to say, okay, I'm not only going to see you, but I'm going to actually acknowledge you and maybe want to connect with your presence. So what that is for me is it is actually something in the business of courage to be curious. And because we are insatiably curious, and there's so many things that I find fascinating, is that one of the things that I've both had fun with, but also struggled with is the number of different directions that courage to be curious has gone in and that it can go in. And there's this thing that has been standing right in front of me. In fact, if I'm coaching other clients, I'll even say to them, the narrower that you go, the more kind of focused you become, the more you can niche. And I have this one coach who graduated from my coaching program who became a thyroid coach. Talk about being specific. She became a thyroid coach. She only deals with people with thyroid issues. One of the most successful coaches, graduates of our program, because she went so narrow. And if I were guiding anybody else, that's what I would tell them to do. And this thing has been like sitting right there. It's almost like just sitting there in the corner, like, right, I'm still here. Yep, I'm not going away because there's still something really important going on here. And, not being able to rein in. I think initially there were some pieces of, well, how do I know which is the right thing? And I got caught in the trap that I think lots of people in our kind of industry is like, which is the right thing to do? Then I got that out of the way. And I was like, but there's so many interesting things and I like doing them all. And so I would diversify in all of these directions, doing a lot of interesting things, but not really growing the business. And I always had this tension and pull between being excited and fascinated, but also a little unhappy and dissatisfied with the fact that I wasn't really building in the way I wanted to be building. And that little, what you just pointed out, that thing that's right in front of me has been sitting there in the corner just saying, what it is. And I'm just going to sit here. I mean, so patient. Like I like to say, thank you for being so incredibly patient. You've like stuck with me for like 12 years or something, like just still sitting there and waiting for me to actually acknowledge your presence. And I would say it's not until this year, as people have been experiencing the relaunch, where I have been willing, had the courage, maybe a shift in some fundamental beliefs to say, I get you now. Like, I'm now bringing you into my team now. And I'm going to let you be my guide rather than just sitting on the side.
Yeah, what's coming up for me that's so interesting on that is, you've been able to guide your clients through that, and for all of us as coaches and for all of us as humans, if we think about the piece of advice that we're most likely to give someone else, it's usually the one that we most need to hear, right? So I've been told, we teach that which we most need to learn. So I think when you're answering that question, what keeps appearing in front of me that I refuse to see, if you pull that out of your deck and you're having trouble answering it, it's a pretty quick route to just say, or what am I telling everyone else?
Absolutely. You're so spot on there, right? If we just paused to listen to ourselves, we would know exactly what it was. And, I think as coaches, we know that the things that come up in our coaching sessions are very much like projections of things that we like need to hear or are experiencing too. And sometimes I've actually finished a coaching session and being like, I should be paying that person because they brought up the very thing that I need to be looking at right now and seeing, and they gave me an opportunity to explore it at the same time that they were exploring it. And so absolutely, that's true. And I think also seeing the thing that's right in front of us that we're not paying attention to. I do, and I want to put out there because there's always, sometimes we're not seeing it because it's not the right time, and that's legitimate. Like it's not the right time to be seeing and to really engaging. Like we can know it's there and everything in its right time. And then the other part is the honesty about what's the fear there. What's the fear? And for me, it's interesting. There were a few different fears that I think came up around this. One is I'm always afraid of being bored. Like I'm being afraid that if I go narrow or really focus on something that eventually I'll get bored. And that's something that I've had to interrogate. Like, where did that come from? How true is that? And why does that keep coming up for me? Right? Because when you're curious, you're never really bored. So why does that like hit me there? And if I'm going to be totally honest, which I want to be, because I want people to be honest with themselves, like that's a really interesting response and not a really helpful one, I think, but one that is true. So I'm, if I want to be courageous, it's like, where does that come from? What's behind that?
Yes. And, the idea that, you're going to pick this direction and you will now be chained to that for the rest of your natural life. There's going to be some sort of process, some sort of evolution for you, some sort of deepening of it, some tweak here or there that will keep it fresh for you is my assumption. But I think it's interesting that the thing that we're afraid of a lot of times is that we're going to be stuck with it forever and it's going to feel bad.
Yeah, there are those of us who are afraid to be stuck with something forever, and those who want to have the same thing forever and afraid to have anything change or just let it go, right?
I love that. That is the other side of that coin, right? Let me just dig into this thing so I can be comfortable forever.
Right. And neither one are helpful. And, Amy, I would say that you're so intuitive and you're spot on. And then I'm going to pick a question for you. But this whole notion of putting roots in and feeling like something is fixed, and it's not fixed forever. I could change anything I wanted in another 5 years. And intellectually, I know that. But that has been something that I've struggled with of, rooting something down in place because of this lurking sensation of, will I be stuck there? And will I not have the opportunity to jump into other things that might seem exciting or adventuresome, like the FOMO. Maybe it's FOMO, like fear of missing out. Like if I go here, where am I not going? Right. That actually just sort of came up from this, right? Is there a bit of FOMO there?
Yeah, I think that resonates for me in terms of what I hear a lot from other people. If I make this choice, what choices am I not making? And oh my God, so then there's this idea of, how do I trust my instincts, my intuition, and the fact that I am not stuck here forever, that if this doesn't work, those other things may or may not still be out there, but something else, something better will. And, we have to look at our own life experience that way, right? We're so afraid we're going to get stuck and, we've never been able to hold on to anything forever.
That was good examination. I like that. I
That
encountered
was one little question.
one little question. We could go on for a long time. All right, let me pick one for you, Amy. I got my
All right.
cards here. Okay, actually, this one's nice. Who do I appreciate in my life, and what do I appreciate about them?
Oh my gosh, the list is long and distinguished. Well, I have to start at home with my husband, who sees me, who knows me. I'm so grateful for that. What was the question again?
Who do I appreciate in my life? And what
Appreciate.
do
Okay,
I
so it is gratitude. What do I appreciate? Yeah, I appreciate his willingness to go deep. I appreciate that he reads 2 or 3 newspapers every day, that he's smart and well informed. I appreciate the coffee that is on the coffee table, on the bedside table when I wake up in the morning. I appreciate that he pushes me to be better, that he recognizes what I'm good at and wants me to do more of it. Yeah, I appreciate that he's on my side, like totally, completely, utterly on my side, which is just brilliant. I mean, I whatever might be wrong with our relationship, that's what's right with it. He just is totally on my side. Does his own work. I appreciate that, right? Doesn't ask me to do his growth work for him. Gosh, I could go on and on. So, Dave.
So can I just pause you there for a second and ask you a question?
Sure.
So what did it feel like to you to talk about him in that way?
I feel almost like guilty, like, how did I get so lucky? And is it okay for me to have that, right? Do I deserve it? I start to question that a little bit. But it's my life in a way. I can't believe how lucky I am that this is my life, and there are, it's not perfect. Of course it's not. But I always say that it's perfect in its imperfection. There's nothing that I'm content. People get a little wrapped around the axle on contentment, thinking it means I don't want things to change. I don't want anything, to get better. And that's not true. It's just that in this moment, when I look at the journey, when I look at where we started and where we are now and how we've handled that together as a team, it feels amazing. It's just, I'm making the giddy face for those who can't see it. It's pretty special. It's pretty extraordinary. And I know that not everybody has that.
So if I wanted to just ask you, so if you kind of go inside your body, like maybe even close your eyes for a second, and you think about literally, what does it physically feel to talk about this appreciation that you have for him? Like, what does that feel like, as opposed to when we might have been talking about, just kind of other things about questions? What does it feel like to talk about him?
There's a lightness about it. There's like a tingling lightness about it. It's just, part of me, again, wants to stand on the rooftop and be like, oh my God, I have this thing. I have this person in my life that is just so there for me. So I would just, I'd say there's a lightness. I'm a little bit taller. I don't know if it's showing up on the video, but I'm a little bit taller. I feel full. My cup runneth over. I feel very full, and and I remember thinking this on the day I got married. I just remember thinking how easy it is to be generous when I have that feeling of being full, right? Of being seen, of being heard. I don't need or want anything. So it's easy for me to give that to others.
And I want to just make this comment because if somebody is listening or watching this and thinking about the difference between the two questions, like one of them seemed to sort of like penetrate into your, into my space of like, okay, make you be a little bit more kind of critical of yourself and what's going on. And let's sort of examine. And this one, what do I appreciate? There's a lightness to that question, right? The questions have different kinds of energy to them. I think. And you're like, you're having a moment right now.
Yeah, I'm having a moment. I mean, I'm looking at the question and I know how important language is when we're asking these questions. And, what keeps appearing right in front of me that I refuse to see. You're right. There's like I'm refusing. Therefore, there's maybe some judgment behind that.
Yeah, I don't, there could be judgment, or it could just be sort of, it almost says to look deeply at this and, engage, permit yourself to look critically at it. I mean, I think the question sort of, says to you, this is a place for you to kind of really examine something, or that was the intention behind it, right? If we talk about intention, and then there are questions in this deck. What do I appreciate? For the very reason that you just said so beautifully, because in answering them, we might fill our bucket up. Like you just said, I feel like I'm running over, I'm doing, all of this. And, in the question that I answered, I was more like, this is interesting. I'm learning about myself. I'm seeing something I didn't see before. And that's one kind of, that's facilitating this growth. And then the other part is asking, yours is like a question. And some of these, it's like, sometimes it's to ask a question because it fills somebody up and it's just so beautiful.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, and I think the language is important. I'm maybe getting a little wrapped around the axle on the word refusal, that I refuse to see, and maybe it's resist, because you're not refusing it. I mean, I put it in front of you and you answered it. You looked at it.
I think the reason I chose refuse in writing that, because I love that you're bringing up language because it's so good. I think the reason I chose refuse is I specifically chose like an even more, words have like vibrations to them, right? And resist has just a slightly softer vibration than refuse, right? And so
absolutely,
the word refuse sort of like compels you. I wanted it to compel you to look at something instead of just sort of like, okay, well, we could look at that. But I wanted you to feel compelled. And the word refuse seemed to me, and it's going to be different for different people, but for me, seemed to be like, have this compelling nature to it.
I think it does. And I think what's coming up for me is, this is my own neurosis, like my own like fear of, oh my God, why did I pick a question that has a word like refuse in it? Why did I pick the question that had the hard resonance, instead of the something a little bit lighter? What's up with me that I wanted to put something in front of Adina that she's been refusing to see? And I think, this absolutely has to do with my own experience as a beginning coach, of really wanting to, hit it hard. And I don't, I don't see myself doing that as much anymore. I'm still targeted, I think, but for me, I'm like, oh gosh, was I being a jerk? What are you refusing to see, Adina?
Well, and isn't that like, you just did that? And again, if you're watching, you would have seen Amy's like face that really matched that tone of voice. If I say, what's right in front of you that you're refusing to see, right? I can put a sense of judgment in my voice. I can have a facial expression that expresses judgment, and sort of like I'm pointing the finger at you, like, this thing is obvious out here. You're refusing to see it. Get on board, right? So I could convey that with my tone and with my voice. The way you asked it, however, engaged my curiosity, and it made me totally think, and I went totally into reflective, introspective space. I think it's important what you're raising, because if you do pick a card or somebody asks you a question and you have a really strong reaction to it, that's a good thing to get curious about too. Why am I having such a strong reaction to that? And then I love the game of, okay, if that question is hitting me in a way that makes it almost inaccessible to answer, what words could I shift around or substitute? They then give me access.
Absolutely. Beautiful.
And let's not be afraid to play with our questions, because they're not like hard and fast and fixed, and there's no like biblical authority to the way that they're written. If playing with a word or a phrase or something like that creates more accessibility in something, then let's do that for ourselves. If you were to open up my journal, and I've, sort of threatened that I'm going to start taking pictures of my journal so people can see this, but, you will sometimes see me like writing multiple versions of a question until I find that resonant. Let's come back to that word resonant one, because sometimes I'm like reading the phrasing and I'm like, oh, that doesn't really seem to get it quite right, or that language doesn't feel exactly right. That feels more judgmental than I want to be. That feels like it takes my head in a different direction. That one actually feels like I'm avoiding the issue. That one, and so I'll keep playing with the structure of a question until I get that experience of resonance that we talked about in the very beginning that says, ah, when I read that, I can absolutely know that is the right question.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and I think anyone who is, thinking about doing this, picking a question partner, which I highly recommend, pick someone to work through some of these questions with, or play through some of these questions with, and talk about the questions themselves and how they feel and, what they trigger.
I love that. And so I will, you brought it up. So I'm just going to say I'm planting seeds. I'm going to be planting seeds for about 5 months here, I think. Planting seeds for a program that we're going to be launching in 2022, which is Question of the Week, which are live events, Amy, to do just that, where we are going to be offering questions, guidance for thinking it, a community to think about it with, question partners, growth partners to do that with. And this is actually going to become a global wide program that we are going to launch for people who are curious seekers, like I would call you and I here. So I'm just planting some seeds right here. We'll see more about this because January 2022 is going to be a huge launch for that.
There you have it. Okay. I'm a good straight man.
So, Amy, this was about actually asking each other questions, which I love. And I think in this episode, maybe let's each of us say, what are we hoping people are going to most take from having listened to this episode? So, Amy, what in your kind of deepest heart of hearts do you wish for people as they're coming away from this episode?
I wish for them to, and this is going to sound kind of trite, but I wish for them to develop that courage and that curiosity to want to know and to want to ask more questions and to be little scientists, little social scientists, and go out there and experiment. I want for them to feel free to try things and free to fail with them and free to see what happens.
That's, beautiful. And that playfulness, like, let's go play, right? And I think I would want to say, I would like people to see curiosity and asking questions as the ultimate alternative to judgment.
Say that again, please.
I would like for people to experience questions and curiosity as the ultimate alternative to judgment.
Well, and that's exactly what it's done for me, right? So in past episodes, I've talked about, a very judgmental upbringing, where I did that all the time. And this is what's been saving me. So yes to that, a hearty yes.
So
the alternative to judgment.
Whether we're harsh on ourselves or we find, and I'll just share this little bit of story. So I'm Jewish, and every year on the holiday of Yom Kippur, we're supposed to atone for our sins. And I remember, like, my entire life, like from the time I sort of became conscious of things like this, probably in my teens, all the way into my mid 40s before I started discovering curiosity. There's this thing like, for the sin I have committed, and then you name gazillions of sins, ones that you've done and ones that would just have been part of a more global community. But the ones that always struck me, the resonant ones, were always the sins of judgment and sins of using words and speech in ways that were hurtful, whether that was to myself or others. And it stemmed, I think, from an insecurity inside me. And so I was kind of like shielding my insecurity by judging others on the outside. And I was really frustrated with the fact that every single year I would go and I would beat on my chest for like the same things, but it didn't seem to beat it out of me, right? I was still every single year committing the same sins of speech to others, and then also in the ways I was talking to myself, which for many of us is much harsher than we would ever talk to another human being. And it was in embracing curiosity and the asking of questions, that was the winning move that turned me away from that. And not that I never say something that I wish I could reframe a different way or that wasn't hurtful, but it's not a regular practice of how I live. I don't speak harshly to myself anymore. And I don't carry any judgment because I carry curiosity, and curiosity and judgment can't live in the same place together.
That's gorgeous.
So I would want people walking away saying, if I don't like either how judgmental I am of myself or of others, to say, let me try this. Let me try curiosity as an alternative. And this is what we do every single week on the Pure podcast and in our blogs is we get curious. So come along for that ride.
Well, and if we think about what's happening in the world and political situations and tension and strife, and what if everyone stopped just deciding who they liked and who they didn't and why they thought they were that way and just got curious? What would happen to the world if we approached everything with curiosity as opposed to, here's what you're doing, and I know you're doing it?
Absolutely. Well, Amy, this has been amazing. And just to, again, preview, this is our Live episode, the beginning of September. We are going to be embracing the power of questions in love and in relationships next week. And then leadership. We will be looking at it in leadership. And then we will come back to love in the third week. And then we will have our grand finale episode and Amy's favorite part of being on the podcast, which is asking those surprise questions. So in our finale episode, we are always surprising each other with questions and seeing what happens. And so we will do that along with our guest, Chad Littlefield, who will be with us for that grand finale. And if you want to travel this journey with us about asking powerful questions, we encourage you to get the book. Listen on Audible. You actually have, from the time of listening, probably a week to get partly into it, or go on to their webpage. We and Me is the name of their company, and you can experience a little bit of Will Wise and Chad Littlefield and the work that they do around asking powerful questions. And if you actually do that and you end up with a burning question you want me to make sure to ask them, then go ahead and send an email to info@couragetobecurious.com. I would love, love, love to have people sending in a question and say, could you ask Will or Chad this question? So that would be awesome. And we will be back again with you next week with Courage to Be Curious with Adina Tovel. Amy will be with us again. We will see you soon, Amy. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's a delight.